Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the IISS. My name is Antoine Levesque. I'm a research fellow for South Asia here. We're gathered today to hold a discussion which I think will be slightly different from some of the ones we've held on South Asia in recent times, and I'm delighted that we have the opportunity for this. We are gathered to discuss non-proliferation norms and the specific question of their universalization. And we're very fortunate today to have a particular point of view from Pakistan. Although Pakistan is not a signatory to the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty, Islamabad places importance on its international recognition as a nuclear weapon state, and is at the same time seeking access to the peaceful uses of energy. Adherence to nuclear non-proliferation norms is a privileged means to achieving this outside the NPT. While non-signatories will not participate in the next NPT review conference due in 2020, their views will certainly shape some of its deliberations. So the broader questions at stake here are: what has been done to universalize non-proliferation commitments to include states outside the NPT? What more can be done globally and regionally? And what, in regard to Pakistan, is its stance on this and why? And what is Pakistan doing to help international security through the promotion of non-proliferation norms? We are particularly privileged to have with us today Dr. Adil Sultan, who will discuss these issues with us. Dr. Adil is an old friend of the Institute and the South Asia Programme in particular. He was a IISS visiting fellow for strategic affairs already 4 years ago. He has since returned to London for a visiting fellowship at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. This spell is coming to its end, so we're very fortunate also in that context that you've been able to take time to brief us on your thoughts on this. Dr. Sultan has just published the findings of his research in a book which was formally put out at the end of last year, I believe, or the very beginning of this year, on which he will draw for his remarks today and I hope go beyond. Without further ado, I'd want to pass over the floor to Dr. Sultan, and again, welcome back to the IISS. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Antoine. Thank you, Rahul and Viraj, and thank you for IISS for arranging this wonderful team of South Asia. And I see it's expanding, so I met another bright research assistant from South Asia. Whatever I'm going to say is basically my personal view, not the official policy. So, because it is based on my PhD thesis from 2013, and then subsequently I evolved into a book format while at King's College London. So, the book, people who understand South Asia would somehow believe that probably the book is already obsolete because it talks about India, Pakistan, talking bilaterally on non-proliferation issues, which is quite unrealistic apparently. But people like Rahul, who are very optimistic, and myself also, there's a cycle between India and Pakistan always. After every major crisis, both India and Pakistan, they have engaged with each other, and there is a possibility that after the elections, 2019 elections next month or so, India and Pakistan may resume their dialogue process. So this book, once I wrote, this crisis had not happened, the Pulwama crisis, but this is a phase which continues to happen in South Asia, and both India and Pakistan have a record of engaging, disengaging with each other. So I'm quite optimistic about this thing. So even if nothing happens between India and Pakistan, this book provides historical background of CBM process, engagement between India and Pakistan, whatever has happened before between the two countries. So anybody who is interested in South Asian issues would have quite a lot of stuff in this, the details of CBM process previously, and besides the proposals that I am giving in my book. So there are two parts of today's talk. I'll just give you a brief background about the CBM process and why India and Pakistan acquired nuclear weapons. I am sure this knowledgeable people sitting here, they all understand why India and Pakistan acquired, but just to contextualize my arguments, I'll briefly cover those. In the second part, I'll identify challenges faced by the global non-proliferation regime and how to bring the non-NPT states into mainstream non-proliferation regime. So before going to the book details, why is it important to understand the proliferation puzzle? In my view, the nuclear drivers that drive nuclear or the encourages states to pursue the nuclear weapons program also decisively influence their nuclear policies, nuclear use policies, and also the arms control approaches also. And I'll explain it how it is. I took this model, which is known to many scholars, discussed by many peoples. This the three models: security, prestige, or domestic politics, discussed by Scott Sagan and several other scholars to identify the main drivers why India and Pakistan acquired their nuclear weapons. So, going first on India, if you look at the history, India's nuclear program started in 1950s. Once there was no existential threat to India. At that time, India-China relations were like, in Hindi they say, Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, like Indians and Chinese are like brothers. So there was no existential threat. So in 1958, once Homi J. Bhabha made that statement that India can produce a nuclear bomb, whether it was to promote the bureaucratic interest, his personal interest, or institutional interest, whatever it is, but it does reflect that there was some thinking at the decision-making level to have a dual-track nuclear program, the military aspects also. So this thought was there once India and China were very close buddies at that time. In 1962, the conflict between India and China, that also did not trigger any serious debate to fast-track nuclear weapons program in India. So India continued showing that it has the capability, but there was no serious movement towards weapons acquisition. So in 1964, once China tested its first nuclear device, even then there was some debate in the parliament, but there was no serious effort again in India to fast track its nuclear program. Instead, India waited for another 10 years and tested its first nuclear device in 1974, and that was also labeled as peaceful nuclear explosion because there was no justification for India to come out as a nuclear weapon state at that time. So if you analyze India's nuclear drivers, I think it was more of a prestige driven, and then the domestic politics consideration. The 1974 test was also driven by, because Prime Minister Indira Gandhi wanted to establish her nationalist credentials, so that was also a factor, driving factor. Security is a more recent phenomenon. The post-Cold War era, once China is seen as a major adversary to India, so now security is coming into as one of the main consideration for India, but it was not the driver for India's nuclear program. That's what I'm saying. Looking at Pakistan nuclear program, Pakistan did not have the resources, nor neither the infrastructure at that time. It got a research director from the United States, so it was a very modest nuclear program, basically peaceful applications. And once India was moving towards weapons or development or the military technology, it was pursuing that. So Pakistan did continue to raise this concern to the international community. And before the 1974 test also, Pakistan did highlight this danger that India would test and it would be termed as a peaceful nuclear explosion. So this is all part of the history and official documents. So once India tested its device, Pakistan said we have to do it no matter what. So in 1975, Pakistan started its nuclear weapons program. So the driver for Pakistan to start its nuclear program was security because of the existential threat that it faced from India. Again, like India, there was domestic consideration also in Pakistan because Bhutto, he wanted to establish his nationalist credentials. He made some statements, so he used nuclear card to build his credentials. So there was element of domestic politics also, but prestige was never a consideration for Pakistan to pursue its nuclear program. So if we see both India-Pakistan program, it's a result of multi-causality, that is more than one factors like the other nuclear weapon states also, but there is one leading driver. In India's case it is prestige, and in Pakistan's case it is security. Briefly talking about this, like I said, how does this affect on arms control approaches? If we see India's approach towards NPT, CTBT, it has always linked its position with other major powers. India was very actively engaged in negotiating the NPT draft text. Once the text was finalized, India refused and termed it as nuclear apartheid because it differentiates between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. Likewise in CTBT and towards nuclear disarmament also, because India has always linked its position with other major powers. On the other hand, Pakistan's position towards arms control had been always India-centric. If India signs NPT, Pakistan would sign NPT. If India doesn't sign, Pakistan will not. Likewise on CTBT also. And if we see that the proposals that I have discussed in my book in detail, several proposals given by Pakistan, South Asia, declaring South Asia as a nuclear weapon-free zone in 1974, mutual inspections of nuclear facilities in 1979, simultaneous acceptance of full scope safeguards, simultaneous accession to NPT, bilateral test ban treaty. The proposal was given by Pakistan in 1987 and more recently again in 2016. So Pakistan's proposals were all linked to India. These were all pre-1998, before Pakistan became a declared nuclear weapon state. Post-1998, then Pakistan moved away from preventing the nuclearization of South Asia to limiting or restraining the nuclear competition between India and Pakistan. So this proposal came in the strategic restraint regime, which had three interlocking elements: conflict resolution, nuclear and missile restraint, and conventional balance. This proposal is still on the table, but India is not ready to discuss it with Pakistan. Briefly talking about the CBM process between India and Pakistan. So after 1998, both India and Pakistan, they agreed to start discussing confidence building measures, and it came out in the form of Lahore MOU in 1999, which talked about bilateral consultation on security concepts, doctrines, convention, nuclear CBMs, and various other aspects. But then Kargil happened, and then 2001 militant attack, so there was a deadlock, nothing happened. And then in 2004 this dialogue resumed in the form of a composite dialogue process. So most of the major elements that were agreed in the 99 MOU were taken from that draft and incorporated into this new process that was started in 2004. One of the important statement that came out in June 2004 between India and Pakistan, both countries agreed that nuclear weapons are a factor of stability in the region. So that was a recognition, very important. This process continued to 2012, and then onwards there's a deadlock. There's no further round on CBMs. Now coming to main book contents. The four questions that need to be asked: what are the challenges faced by the existing NPT-based non-proliferation regime? Why it is important to universalize the non-proliferation regime? How can it be achieved? Why it may or may not work? So these are four issues that I have discussed in my book. First, coming to the challenges. Now, number one challenge is the nuclear disarmament. Reluctance by the NPT nuclear weapon states to give up their nuclear weapons because they have a different interpretation of Article 6 of the NPT. They say that we only committed to work in good faith, whereas the rest of the international community believe that it's a legally binding obligation for the nuclear weapon states. So there's a disagreement and a deadlock. Then second is the issue of non-compliance by the NPT signatories. There are certain states who are accused of not fulfilling their NPT-related obligations, and they're accused of building latent nuclear capabilities. So that's a challenge again by the NPT. The third is the non-state actors, which do not come under any legally binding obligation. How to deal with that? NPT is not equipped. International Non-Proliferation Regime is not equipped. There is Security Council Resolution 1540, but again, that's not comprehensive. The fourth is threat from parallel arrangements like the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons or the Ban Treaty, because several of the clauses are overlapping. So it has in fact weakened the NPT-based non-proliferation regime, and that's what the debate is ongoing towards 2020 NPT. This is one of the irritants for reaching a consensus. Finally, the non-universal nature of the NPT. The 4 out of the 9 nuclear weapon states are outside any non-proliferation obligations. So unless these states are not brought into mainstream non-proliferation regime, the goal of global nuclear disarmament cannot be achieved. And if the regime is made universal, it would also reduce incentive for other potential NPT signatories to break away, or those states that are considering to break away from the NPT-related obligations. So if the regime is universal, there is lesser incentive for states to give up their non-proliferation obligations within the NPT. Some of the pathways, my proposal is not completely a new one. I took certain elements from the previous discussions that have taken place around the globe, how to deal with these non-NPT signatories. There was a proposal by International Commission on Nuclear Disarmament that said we need to encourage the 3 non-NPT nuclear weapon states to join parallel instruments in return for access to peaceful uses of nuclear technology. But that proposal did not mention any parallel instrument, or what instrument can replace NPT for these 3 states, or now the 4 states, including North Korea also. But at that time, North Korea was not there. Second was about this Avner Cohen and other peoples. They talked about that we should negotiate a separate protocol for the non-NPT states in return for their recognition as nuclear weapon state. And they also said that 3 non-NPT states could sign a separate protocol and participate in international export control regimes, commit not to test and freeze a nuclear program. And once they accept these kind of obligations, this would bring these 3 states at par with other 5 NPT nuclear weapon states. And whenever there is a movement on global nuclear disarmament, these 3 states can also be asked to join the global process. In 2007, Israel also presented criteria to bring the 3 non-NPT states into mainstream non-proliferation regime, but essentially it was targeted towards Israel and India only, and excluding Pakistan. Because it said we should recognize, or the international community can recognize the nuclear status with a cutoff date of May 1998, because at present it is all those states which tested their nuclear devices before 1st January 1967 under the NPT, they are considered as nuclear weapon states, and rest all are non-nuclear weapon states. So Israel proposed if we can move forward this date, so it will address this problem of India and Pakistan also, but they also added a caveat that a potential or aspirant state should have a democratically elected government. At that time, Pakistan was under military rule, so it was definitely, obviously intended to keep Pakistan out and integrate both Israel and India into it. Now coming to the regional non-proliferation regime proposal that I have discussed in detail in my book, why I am taking this regional approach. I believe that compartmentalization of the problem, it helps, it becomes easier to develop a consensus because of interdependent security priorities of these states. So I've taken this regional security complex model of Barry Buzan and Old Weaver. That's a theoretical framework, and under that framework I've discussed how to bring India, Pakistan into this. have kept Israel out because Israel is not part of South Asia, one. Secondly, Israel is not technically a nuclear weapon state because it has not tested as yet. Third, bringing Israel would open a Pandora box because there are several other Middle Eastern states. They will never accept Israel to be recognized as a nuclear weapon. Several other Middle Eastern states would not recognize Israel as a nuclear weapon state in this. There's also a problem with this. India might insist on inclusion of China into this regional kind of arrangement, but China is already an NPT state. So it is under legally binding obligation. There is no point to bring China into this regional non-proliferation regime, which is basically intended to bring the non-NPT state or give recognition to the non-NPT states or bring them into mainstream non-proliferation regime. Some of the possible elements, not all could be applicable, but there are several elements that I have discussed with pros and cons. So it could be that these two states, India and Pakistan, could be asked to adhere to the main clauses of the NPT, like Article 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. They already publicly announced that they will not give the nuclear technology. They have also announced they will not acquire nuclear weapons technology from other countries on safeguard. So they have a very clear position, and they want to get access to peaceful nuclear technology. So that's Article 4. And they also support nuclear disarmament, but global disarmament. So that's Article 6. So those are main elements of the NPT that could be translated into a kind of regional non-proliferation treaty between India and Pakistan. They can also collaborate on export control related issues, and both can also work towards maybe a global export control treaty, because this is an issue many states, they find it difficult to fulfill their obligations for all the four export control regime. And people like Mark Hibbs in their IISS paper have also given this idea to have a global export control regime, so that states are not pushed to fulfill their obligation for all the four different regimes, but if there is one comprehensive regime, that could be useful. So India and Pakistan, since they publicly say that they adhere to the export control regimes, India is already part of the three export control regime minus the NSG, so they could probably agree to that. They can also agree to regional nuclear fuel cycle approaches, because that's what IEA is promoting. Both countries, they operate CANDU type reactors also. Both countries, they are deficit of fuel, they import fuel. So if they can have a kind of bilateral regional non-proliferation, regional nuclear fuel cycle facilities, it seems very idealistic, but I'm looking at several years from now, so not immediately. So this could be considered. And then collaboration on counter-proliferation initiatives like Container Security Initiative, Megaport Initiative, all those initiatives, they do engage with the United States on these counter-proliferation initiatives. So they do also have interest to prevent proliferation of nuclear and sensitive technology, so they can collaborate on this. Why it may work? Both India and Pakistan, they have shown interest to join the NSG, and they want to join the NSG. So this is a way to bring them under some international non-proliferation obligations in return for their recognition in nuclear weapons states, and also offering their place in the nuclear suppliers group. So if there is a tangible incentive, there is a possibility that India and Pakistan could engage bilaterally. And if you see the history on arms control issues, notwithstanding the public differences that India and Pakistan have on several arms control issues, they have similarity of approach at the United Nations, at the Conference on Disarmament, and other forums. So they do coordinate their position because they have common interests. So there is a possibility and the likelihood of such kind of an engagement. And of course, the major or the overarching reason for this whole approach is that they want to be recognized as responsible nuclear weapon states and part of the NSG. So this is an alternate way to bring them under international regime in return for their NSG membership. But whatever the criteria has to be decided, obviously it has to be objective and non-discriminatory. Some of the elements could be integrated, not all, so I'm just giving these ideas. Now, The problematic part, why it may not work. Both India and Pakistan have a long history of disputes. They have differences. They seldom sit together and reach a common position. And there are ongoing efforts to dehyphenate India-Pakistan security equation also. So India is also being given preferential treatment in the form of India-US nuclear deal, the membership in the export control regime, the WASDA arrangement, Australia group, the MTCR, except for the energy, United States has facilitated India. So if India is getting so much concessions, why would it engage with Pakistan just to get the membership of the NSG? But India has seen that it could not get the NSG membership, and there is a limit of external powers also, their influence also, and they have also seen unless this approach is non-discriminatory, objective, it's quite difficult to bring India into the NSG. So these are some of the problems. Finally, just to conclude, the whole concept may seem idealistic and difficult to implement, but in the absence of any other mechanism, we can't just keep these two states as they are and continue talking about the success of NPT and the disarmament. It is not going to work unless these states are given the due recognition and integrated into mainstream non-proliferation regime. This has to be done. The regional non-proliferation regime serves the interests of both the countries, besides helping to make the global non-proliferation regime more universal in nature and help the cause of global nuclear disarmament, as said. And engagement in a regional arrangement between India and Pakistan would also help improve the environment for more confidence-building measures between the two countries, which is much needed. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sultan, and thank you for finishing on time. This discussion has taken us back to familiar questions which we in the South Asia Programme accustomed to dealing with, namely the dynamics and the prospects for improvement of the outlook between India and Pakistan. But I'd like to take a step back, as you also did, and look at the question of global norms. It appears to me that, and one of the reasons for doing this, I think, is also because the Institute is involved in a new strand of work which looks at the future of global norms, the institutions underpinning them, and the processes of norm-making and norm-taking. And I think this conversation really fits in that framework also. You referred to responsibility as being a crucial consideration for Pakistan, also for India, and I wonder how you understand this in the context of the history of Pakistan's involvement, or the involvement of entities based in Pakistan in transnational non-proliferation norm breaches, and the AQ Khan network coming to mind on this. A number of governments have underlined that this was the past, not least your own government, and that these issues had really moved on. But we have been reminded in the last week, actually, that one Pakistani-based entity was put on a list by the US Department of Trade. So I think this continues to pose a challenge to the narrative of responsibility, notwithstanding all the other contributions which you highlighted that Pakistan is making to upholding norms and to actually making norms. So I wonder how you could address that specifically for us, because it seems to me that's one of the triggers or trigger concepts which everyone would rely on to credit Pakistan with its due in your terms, and with its ability to be genuinely a contributor to norm making and not just norm taking.
Okay. One by one?
Okay. Yes, please. Yeah.
The state is on the past record. I think I'll not go into that, but definitely there were things which should not have happened, and that's what Pakistan's position had been. There were loopholes in which individuals indulged in proliferation activities, and Pakistan took remedial measures, and thereon Pakistan had been very proactively engaged in those activities to prevent any future such act by the individuals, and it was not sanctioned by the state, so we all know. And IISS dossier of 2007, I think it also mentions that there were 25 entities, there were many more entities from 25 countries. Was it 25 countries? Yeah, or it's 25, but there's several countries. They were involved in that AQ Khan network, which is incorrectly labeled as AQ Khan network, whereas it is International Non-Proliferation Network, because there were people from Sweden, Switzerland, and the Swiss people, South Africa, Sri Lanka, and the headquarters was in Dubai, so it was not centered in Pakistan. But still, it was something which should not have happened, and that's what Pakistan's message had been since then, that it will not happen from Pakistan. But coming to your question, again, that's the reason. Once the states are outside any obligation international, you cannot hold them accountable for whatever they did. Pakistan did not violate any international law. Or if there were individuals also, they didn't violate any international obligation in that sense, because there were no obligations on Pakistan. Pakistan is not obligated under the NPT or any other international legally binding treaty. So all the more reason that these states were not accountable for any non-proliferation or the proliferation activities, they need to be brought under international regime. But it's unrealistic to expect, as most people at the official level, they continue to say that India, Pakistan, they should give up the nuclear weapons and join as non-nuclear weapon state at the NPT. One has to be realistic, this is not going to happen. So if this is not going to happen, either you keep them out and continue to come up with these accusations that the entities, more entities, and by the way, these entities are not only of Pakistan, there were other entities several months before also, there were certain entities, but it's more of a politically driven, because there were several entities from the UAE and many other responsible countries also. Their entities were also included in the US trade list also. That's a different thing, nothing to do with nuclear proliferation, I suppose. So the core argument, if you don't bring these states under international obligations, you cannot hold them accountable. So if you want to hold them accountable, bring them under international obligations, and this is not going to be a unilateral concession. It has to be mutually or reciprocity. Yeah, they are nuclear weapon states, their status has to be recognized, only then they can commit towards any disarmament and non-proliferation. I hope I answered this.
Yes, thank you. We now have 25 plus minutes for questions and answers. I have a couple of hands up. I'm aware that you provided us, Dr. Sultan, with quite a list of options and ideas to move forwards. They're all consigned in your book, so I would encourage many of you interested to really take a look, because the details are really crucial in that regard. But any discussion of the many points you made would be, I think, really quite interesting. The first person to catch my eye was you, sir. Could you please tell us who you are?
My name is Mahmoud Ali. I'm an adjunct professor of China Studies, but I'm an alumnus of War Studies from many years ago, and a former officer of the Baluch Regiment. So I'm obviously very encouraged by your innovative approach to regionally binding non-proliferation measures. My concern is this. Is there a recognition in Pakistan that there is an asymmetric quadrilateral within which Pakistan is located, that Pakistan is focused on deterring India. India is much more interested in deterring China, whereas China has its sort of interest focused on the United States. And both China and the United States have very differentiated approaches to India and Pakistan. Given that kind of relationship, how strong is your, or how practical or realistic do you think your proposal is in terms of becoming realized, is my question.
This is very interesting because this is what the perception is, and some of the studies that came up with this chain reaction, unless United States doesn't do anything, China will not do anything, and unless China doesn't do anything, India will not do it, unless India doesn't do, Pakistan will not. I've discussed this in the regional security complex, the theoretical that framework, that the interdependent securitization priorities of these states, India and Pakistan. Why China and India equation is not as strong or as it is being projected as adversarial as India-Pakistan is. We have seen Doklam crisis. Both sides, they didn't escalate. India and China, they have more than $80 billion of bilateral trade. So both sides realize it's not good to escalate. Whereas in India-Pakistan scenario, we have seen practical hostilities and series of this crisis that we continue to face. This is more of an excuse not to do anything by bringing China, as the United States wants to bring China into international treaties on missile control, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, because the United States doesn't want to extend that INF, so it is saying unless China is not brought into it, will not negotiate with Russia. So similarly, India, because it's a bilateral security equation, interdependence between India and Pakistan, we have a history of disputes. If you see on the India-China, it's more of a rhetoric. China is a $160 billion of defense budget. India has a $60 billion of defense budget. So many times more, India is not going to get into a conflict with China. Neither China is going to engage in a serious military conflict with India. It doesn't suit their interests. And they don't have a kind of dispute. When we talk about 62 war, it was more of a border conflict between India and China. But as states grow in size, their interest also get a conflict, and there could be a possibility of a conflict in the future. But for now, this is more of a perception that China and India are emerging as major rivals. I don't think so. They are probably as potential competitors, but for now, China is not much worried about India's rise. It is much bigger power than India is. So this proposal is more about it's realistic in a way that both India and China, India and Pakistan, they want to get into mainstream non-proliferation regime. So once there is commonality of interest, even between the adversaries, as we had seen between Soviet Union and the United States, they did engage in bilateral arms control arrangements because it suited both countries. So this proposal is basically not resolving the dispute. It's more of because both countries want to get into mainstream non-proliferation regime, and the international NPT regime, they do not have a formula as yet, or they're least bothered because they continue to discuss global disarmament amongst themselves. By ignoring this, that there are 2 states or 3 states outside, this is a reality. So what I'm suggesting is, if you continue to keep these states outside, might as well you continue discussing global nuclear disarmament. It will never happen because these countries are there. So this is in the interest of international community. This is interest of both India and Pakistan to get into mainstream non-proliferation regime because they have their nuclear energy needs also. They want to be recognized. So there is a commonality of interest despite the kind of relations that we have between India and Pakistan. So it's based on realistic assumptions that probably they can, if they can agree on certain position at conference on disarmament, even on issues like fissile material cut-off treaty or the first committee at the UN on various resolutions, they could possibly consider this in the bilateral engagements.
Thank you. The next question was from the lady at the back. Could you please tell us who you are? Yeah. Yeah, you sir. Yeah.
My name is Kim Oberfell. I work here at I support the Non-Proliferation and Nuclear Policy team. My question is much more NPT focused from an international community perspective. As you said, it makes sense that it is unrealistic to expect India and Pakistan to completely disarm within the next few years. It has not happened over the past year, so why would it happen now? However, on the other side, is it realistic to expect for the international community to accept India and Pakistan as an official nuclear weapon state? And would that not open up the possibility for current NPT parties to see an avenue in the future where, for whatever reason, they would actually consider developing nuclear weapons to withdraw from the NPT, knowing that there might be the possibility that further along in the future they might still be recognized as an official nuclear weapon state?
I agree. This is a very fair point, because several of the NPT non-nuclear weapon states, they would object that they had been honoring international obligation, not pursued nuclear weapons program, with the hope that eventually global nuclear disarmament would happen, and now these 3 states are being given recognition. That's fair, but there's a difference also. These 3 states, why I'm talking about India, Pakistan, possibly Israel also in the future in a separate framework, these states never signed NPT. So their case is different from states that signed NPT and left or are thinking of leaving. So I'm not equating many other states who might in the future might consider giving up their non-proliferation obligation. These states never signed, never violated, but these states are nuclear weapon states outside the NPT. How to deal with that? Like I said previously, keep them outside, and then they should not be held accountable, or bring them in under any international regime so that they can be held accountable, or the regime could be universalized. And if there is sincerity in moving towards global nuclear disarmament, global means all nuclear weapon states, including India and Pakistan, it cannot happen unless these states are brought into under some arrangement through principle of reciprocity.
Thank you. The next question is from my colleague Rahul Roy Chaudhary.
Rahul Roy Chaudhary, Sir, Adil, thank you very much for your presentation. You began by saying that some people may think your book is out of date because the text is between India and Pakistan. I would disagree. And I think it's important to see your book in terms
That's why I say you are very optimistic.
Providing a potential for a template in the future, if and when the talks between India and Pakistan resume. And in that context, I have 2 questions. The first is, Adil, you mentioned the strategic restraint regime and the 3 components of the strategic regime. I wonder if you could just tell us a bit more about how you view the strategic restraint regime in terms of the process of confidence-building measures between the 2 countries. So, for example, if and when the dialogue starts and there is a resumption of the nuclear CBMs, how will Pakistan play its cards on this issue? Will it sort of put across the strategic restraint regime and say, well, this is it, sign up on conflict resolution issues and others, or will it be more nuanced and sophisticated in that sense? And the second question related to this is, in terms of your proposals, I mean, where would they fit in to maybe a revised or a modernized strategic restraint regime proposal from Pakistan in terms of the way forward?
Okay, thank you, Rahul. And that's why I said I've learned a lot from Rahul, because he has always been optimistic even during worst of times between India and Pakistan. About the strategic restraint regime, it's a concept that was given, a wholesome concept given by Pakistan, but once the 2 sides start to discuss, negotiate, it is not mandatory that all elements would be agreed upon by both sides. But once you start discussion, because it stems from the earlier discussions that both sides had in 1999 and 2004 also. They did talk about resolving bilateral disputes, conflict resolution, so this element of conflict resolution. There was talk about missile notification and other CBM measures which did not materialize, so this talks about restraint on missiles, etc. And conventional imbalance, because Pakistan's position is always that there is more the conventional imbalance between India and Pakistan, because, like I said, China, India, 160 and $60 billion. Likewise, Pakistan's $10 billion, India has $60 billion, so 6 times more. So Pakistan feels that more the conventional asymmetry, more reliance on nuclear. So let's talk also about conventional balance also. But these are proposals. And little that I knowledge, practical or the personal experience that I have had while I was working for the government and part of this CBM process, both sides always come up with a menu, and eventually some elements would be picked up, discussed, agreed upon, and negotiated, and we came up with a ballistic missile notification agreement and non-attack on each other's facility, things like that. So it's a wholesome concept to resolve all the issues and also maintain strategic balance between the two countries. But once they will talk, only then, depending upon their mutual interest, definitely India would have its own reservations and position. Likewise, on this proposal, because once I was discussing with these people, with various people, learned people, this concept, many of them outrightly rejected from the very start. You are being too idealistic and working for the government in the military from the Pakistan. It's not going to work. But having involved in the CBM process or the bilateral process, I think whenever we talk, both India and Pakistan, we have come up with something unexpected or bilateral agreements because it suits both sides. So what I then decided was just to bring out all those proposals, even the regional nuclear fuel cycle. Somebody said it's never going to work. I said, why not to discuss? Because if the Central Asian countries, other countries are discussing and the IAEA is promoting this, why not to give a thought as a concept, bring out, maybe one day both countries would realize that we need to maybe work on certain issues or fraction of our nuclear fuel cycle together once there is good relations or there's no conflict between India and Pakistan. It serves them. Maybe they can work directly or indirectly, whatever way. So what I have done is I have discussed these proposals, listed them, and people who would be dealing in the future on the policy side in bilateral CBM process, they can pick and choose whether it works or not. But these are ideas for the future also for the people to.
Thank you. It's important that I think policymakers in the region know that there's a toolkit of readily fleshed out options and ideas they could pick on from in case there was political will to resume such conversations. Could I just ask you a point of detail? When did Pakistan actually formally put forward the strategic restraint regime? Because in the last decade I've heard a lot about it and I've never been able to grasp it practically. Is there a particular sort of tangible moment, a particular document which details it and is a resource for grounding the conversation we just had?
Yeah, October 1998 it was first presented. So I've read the document, but the public sources, I think there are a couple of books that have discussed this very cursory, not in detail, but they have mentioned this, when was it offered or not. But there are open sources information also, not much in detail, but there are some open sources.